He what? He accused the U.S. of building up the Japanese army, right, to take over in Korea after U.S. troops are withdrawn. But how? But why? I got nothing. Okay. June 2nd, 1952. Syngman Rhee is the president of South Korea, but he's actually worried that he won't be for long. How do you prevent those who might want him out of power from doing anything? Well, if you are Syngman Rhee, you declare martial law in Pusan. I'm Indy Neidell, and this is the Korean War. Last week, there were yet more issues with UN-held POWs, this time in Pusan. Plans were evolving to sort out control at Kojido POW camp once and for all. At the peace table, the UN chief delegate left for good and was replaced, and in the field, the Filipinos had some good success against the Chinese. A couple of weeks ago, I talked about some forced concessions that the communists got from some captured American airmen, that the U.S. is practicing bacteriological warfare over North Korea and China. For all that you might think this is a bit fantastic, a lot of people around the world do believe the charges, but it's now going one step beyond. Their campaign now supported by live witnesses, the communists now sought to make germ warfare a major issue. Bak Hon-yong, the North Korean Minister for Public Affairs, charged that the Americans had dropped flies, fleas, ticks, mosquitoes, and spiders to spread contagious diseases. Zhao Enlai, you remember him, the Chinese foreign minister, issues a statement that 68 formations of American planes made no fewer than 448 sorties over northeastern China, scattering disease-bearing insects. Oh yes, the Chinese and North Koreans are undergoing a massive inoculation campaign just now, and when I say it's for everyone, that includes General William Dean. You remember him too? He was captured the first month of the war, and now, even as a POW, he's getting his shots. There is also this, though. The communists succeeded in stirring up such a hate America campaign that, according to Dean, a downed airman had virtually no chance of getting away from his wrecked plane or parachute. Chinese and Korean officers who wanted the flyers for intelligence purposes had to race farmers and villagers. The latter usually won. The communists had succeeded all too well in convincing villagers that the timeless diseases that had ravaged Korea could now be blamed on American imperialists. There are even germ warfare displays in places like Peking, which have both the written and recorded confessions of Ken Enoch and John Quinn, who, as we saw a couple weeks ago, were captured in January and broken after 5 weeks' interrogation. The displays also feature loads of insects gathered in North Korea and statements from local villagers about the horrors. The UN is also receiving hundreds of petitions from supposed international organizations, but ones that are actually run by communist groups, to condemn the U.S. for this disgraceful activity. Just making the charges is pretty disgraceful, but that is the way the world works today. And the war goes on. And for all that's happening, a radical change in the course of the action being pursued in Korea was impossible under the circumstances. Although the military leaders in the field might chafe under the restrictions imposed upon them, there was little prospect that these would be altered except in detail. They could not be, in fact, without augmenting the military forces at the disposal of General Clark. Everyone knows, and has known for like a year now, that as things stand, 8th Army can hold the line and they can punish their enemy, but they cannot do more than that. That is what limited war means. Limited forces, right? So the war planners have to always plot operations and actions, assuming that their military strength will pretty much remain as it is. This could change if the communists start full-scale war again, but that seems unlikely these days. If the U.S. sends more force to Korea, then that would deplete the strategic reserve at home, and forces for Europe would have to be reduced. They could mobilize more new troops, of course, ramp up conscription, but in an election year and with an unpopular war, that ain't gonna happen. To maintain successfully the military pressure then being exerted upon the communists seemed to warrant increases in the ground, sea, and naval forces in the estimation of the joint planners. But until decisions on a national level established the long and short-range objectives in Korea clearly, even this limited support was impossible. And of course, we have to consider that the UN objectives are not always the same as those of the South Koreans, particularly President Syngman Rhee, as we've seen. Rhee is having trouble, though, staying in control of South Korea. In fact, tensions have come to a head over the autocratic methods of his administration. Now, according to the Korean constitution, legislators in the National Assembly elect the president. And there are indications that Rhee will not be returned to office in the August elections. Perhaps more than indications. See, in the 1950 assembly elections, a month before the war began, Rhee's party only got 25% of the seats. So last August, he told the nation he was organizing a new party, the Liberal Party. He is concerned, though, that they might not win a majority and choose him for president. The last presidential election was 1948. With his characteristic disdain of opponents, Rhee demanded that the Assembly change the Constitution to provide for a popular general election, confident of his ability to sway public opinion. When the Assembly refused, Rhee declared martial law in the Pusan area, where the legislature was sitting, and arrested more than a score of its members on obviously false charges of treason and complicity with the communists. He claims that he has U.S. 8th Army Commander Jim Van Fleet's backing, but Van Fleet denies this, and his stated reason for doing this is military necessity, because Van Fleet's forces have had to deal with a lot of communist guerrilla activity in the area. It was last week on May 25th that martial law was declared in Pusan, but this week features pretty heated exchanges between Rhee, U.S. President Harry Truman, and U.S. State Department officials. Rhee even threatens to remove all ROK, South Korean, troops from combat areas to ensure order in Pusan. The UN protests the martial law declaration, and Rhee does not give a hoot about that. UN Commander Mark Clark tells Washington on the 30th that they may have to tolerate actions by Rhee which are abhorrent and endure embarrassing political incidents precipitated by him. But the threat to remove troops from the combat zone, well, Clark then considers two actions. Either continuing to try and talk Rhee out of his crackdown, hoping he'll listen to reason, or just have a coup, take over, install more amenable leaders. Yep, just topple Rhee and set up an interim government. But Clark was pessimistic about moving against Rhee. He had already alerted one regimental combat team for movement from Japan to Korea, and he had spoken with the ROK Army Chief of Staff about ensuring the technical support of the ROK Army should Rhee attempt to use it against his internal enemies. Any ROK Army units taken out of their combat missions would lose UN logistical support, Clark said, and the 8th Army would block their movement towards Pusan. Clark tells DC to play it cautious and not issue any idle threats, which would only make things worse because he does not have enough force to keep control on Kojido Island, handle major civil disturbances in the rear in Pusan, deal with the guerrilla menace, and also withstand any major communist offensive in the field should all of that happen at once. His recommendation is they just take it, and only take action if Rhee makes a truly intolerable situation, in which case Clark would send in his forces and establish a military government or just martial law, and then they'd play it from there. Today, June 2nd, Clark and Van Fleet actually confront Syngman Rhee and tell him the communists may well take advantage of the confusing situation and launch a major offensive. To quote Golden once again, Rhee was not moved. He could control any situation. He would not interfere with the war, but he would comply with the will of the people. He was so emotional that the American generals wondered whether he had lost his reason. At one point, Rhee even accused the United States of building up the Japanese army to take over in Korea after U.S. troops were withdrawn. Clark tells the Joint Chiefs of Staff that they need to keep dealing with Rhee through diplomacy as much as possible, because if Clark does something like offering protection to the National Assemblyman, that would likely cause enough upheaval that he'd have to take over South Korean affairs, and the world will not like that at all. It's a tricky situation. Another tricky situation is the continuing fallout from the Colson letter, in which General Charles Colson agreed to demands from POWs at Kojido Camp in exchange for the release of their hostage, Camp Commander General Francis Dodd. The quick and summary punishment of the key officers involved did not solve the problem of what to do about Colson's statement or the more basic question of how to clean up the long-standing conditions in the prison camps. Although the Washington leaders did not want to repudiate the letter, they told Clark to deny its validity on the grounds that it was obtained under duress, and Colson had not the authority to accept the false charges contained in the communist demands. The first count was no doubt true, but the second was certainly not. As you can imagine, the press is hungry for a bit more than denial. So on May 27th, U.S. Army Chief of Staff Lieutenant Joe Collins gives Clark the permission to issue a press release. Just a concise and factual one, nothing fancy. And it should really drive home that UN Command always played by the Geneva Convention rules, and they allowed the Red Cross regular access to the camps to check things out, and that the incidents in question were brought about by fanatical communists. Well, I told you last time about what U.S. 8th Army Commander Jim Van Fleet wants to do to sort things out in the camps, and that Bull Boatner is now in charge at Kojido to get things straightened out there, and he has been busy. In fact, I shall continue the saga of Bull Boatner's weeks running Kojido. Now, Paul Yount from 2nd Logistical Command would not let the press in and had sent the Red Cross away, but when Boatner took over, he wanted them back, because he wanted witnesses to everything. One thing that he himself did not want to personally witness, though, was the sloppiness his personnel took with appearances. Some men wore fatigues, some wore semi-dress, but for guard duty, the manual specifies combat fatigues. He asked his executive officer, why all the different uniforms? And the exec said, you don't want your headquarters wearing the same uniforms as the troops, which flabbergasted Boatner. He'd been at Heartbreak Ridge when, the enemy specifically targeted officers when they could pick them out. Why in God's name would he want them singled out here? He also overruled his exec and said each man must carry a sidearm. The exec said there will be lots of accidental discharges, and Boatner said if a soldier can't handle his weapon, he should not be here in the first place. Boatner looked around his headquarters. There were MP troops, engineers, quartermasters, most of whom were unaware there was a war on. Nor were many of these service troops typical of their services. Many officers relieved on the line as unfit had been sent to Kojido as POW guards, and the replacement pipeline had funneled some of the worst into the island, considering the need there less. Boatner loved the Army, and he loved the American soldier, though he had a firm belief the American soldier was only as good as his officers made him. A man unconsciously profane, Boatner thought, Jesus Christ, what a mess. So he pretty quickly began a letter-writing campaign to Washington about the state of his personnel, and asked to screen out 400 of the worst and send them back. Thing is, the staff at Koji does not realize that the eyes of the world really have been on them since the kidnapping of General Dodd. But Boatner does realize something, that he might sit in the commander's chair, but he is not in command at Kojido. Somewhere, in one of those ramshackle compounds filled with thousands and thousands of singing and screaming communist POWs, surrounded by 1 or 2 lines of barbed wire and a handful of guards, somewhere in there is the communist officer who really controls Kojido. Boatner decided that what he had to do would have to be done in 3 phases. Phase 1, he'd just have to show that, unlike previous commanders here, he had the will to actually command, to bring in more force to the island and let the POWs know that he is the boss. Phase 2 would be to build new and really secure compounds for the POWs. And Phase 3 would be actually moving them into them. Well, I already told you that more force was sent in. Some Greeks, some Turks, a British company, a Canadian company, the 187th Airborne Regimental Combat Team, and some tanks to put on the nearby hills to look scary. Van Fleet actually got an earful for ordering the Commonwealth troops to go there, but they went. The other UN governments do not, in fact, want anything to do with Kojido, but Van Fleet feels POWs are as much their problem as the front lines are. Boatner also got $3.5 million to secure the island, and he got busy bringing in more engineers. The old compounds were filled to bursting. The watchtowers were inside the perimeter of fences, where they could be rushed, and the compounds were enclosed by only a single apron of barbed wire, held fast by already rotting saplings instead of solid timber. Everything was makeshift, insecure. The towers would have to be moved without the wire. 3 aprons of wire stretched, more machine guns placed, and stronger fences laid. It did take quite a few days for him to get across the urgency of the position to his troops, but he managed, and they have been very busy. Here's something that might or might not have occurred to you. Having and holding POWs from vastly different cultures in local camps is not something the American Army in 1952 has all that much experience with. They haven't had huge masses of POWs really since the American Civil War, and that's 90 years ago. In World War I, the Allies took care of the job. In World War II, well, the Americans didn't really take POWs in North Africa and Italy until 1943, and while they did take 50,000 or so Italian POWs that year, they sent them to the States. As for Western Europe, the POWs were enemies, at least from a similar culture, most of whom by mid and late 1944 knew that they were beaten. There were never that many Japanese POWs since they often fought to the death. In fact, there are way more Chinese and North Korean POWs right now at just Kojido than Japanese POWs taken by the Western Allies during all of World War II. I say Western because the Soviets took an enormous amount of Japanese prisoners in Manchuria in August 1945. The North Korean and Chinese culture is radically different from that of the UN guards, and specially trained guards sent over from the US do not speak the language nor understand that culture. Of course, the big problem is how Kojido was set up from the start. In the early months of the war, it was supposed to be a short war, so there were no long-term POW arrangements set up. In December 1950, when the UN forces were in retreat and were considering they might actually have to leave Korea, POWs were sent to Kojido specifically so they would not hinder an evacuation from Pusan. Once there, they were out of sight and out of mind. Even more so once the peace talks began last summer. Also on Kojido were enemy agents to keep a pipeline open between North Korea and the island. And to the dedicated communists such as Neidell, a POW of his own blood was as much a potential weapon as a gun. With such a lack of understanding of the real problems or of the men they held, it seemed almost criminal to blame men like Charlie Colson for fumbling the hot potato dumped into their laps. Boatner does have the fortune of the accumulated experience of his predecessors, and one very, very large advantage over them: Bull Boatner speaks fluent Chinese. I will tell you how the phases have gone next week, for this week of the war is now over. With the communists raising a stink about bacteriological weapons, Syngman Rhee raising a stink about everything, and Bull Boatner raising a stink about things that have needed a stink raised about them for quite some time. The Joint Staff Planners wrote a few weeks ago, "At the present time, we are faced with a set of conditions in Korea which preclude, from a military point of view, a conclusion which can be termed satisfactory. Under these unfavorable conditions, it is necessary to determine what immediate objectives and lines of action can be taken which will be least damaging to our national security, international prestige, and long-range objectives." It's a pickle. And there's a real weakness. See, if the communists really refuse to continue the peace talks, then the question of increased military pressure will come up again. But the US and the UN does not have the force to ensure that the communists will accept an armistice on UNC terms without leaving both Europe and the US unacceptably exposed. And to fix that, you not only have to spend at least a year to get the extra personnel and an industrial base and supplies, but you'd have to convince the world to change the global concept of putting Europe first. Good luck with that. Hey, 1 week from today, June 9th, I'm giving an online lecture for the Smithsonian Associates on the Brusilov Offensive in 1916 during World War I, and some stuff related to it, and it's going to be really cool. Any and all of you who are fans of my old World War I channel, The Great War, will not want to miss that. There is a link in the pinned comment with information for tickets and things like that. The TimeGhost Army member of the week here is Arseny Kritshaver. If you do not know, that army is what allows us to produce this series, so join the adventure at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. Do not forget to subscribe. See you next time.